Blessing. Little Timmy did not want to put his offering in the offering plate on Sunday morning. So his grandmother decided she better be real creative with this one. "You don't want that money, honey," she said. "Quick, drop it in the offering plate. It's tainted." Horrified, the little boy obeyed. And after a few seconds, he whispered, "But Grandma, why is the money tainted? Was it dirty?" "Oh, no, dear," she replied. "It's not really dirty. It just tain't yours and it tain't mine. It's God's." The parable that we read today about money is no easy parable to understand, tainted or otherwise. Jesus apparently loves to make our life complicated. The second part, the explanation, that's pretty straightforward. But the parable itself about a crooked man, our translation says manager, but steward is what it is in the traditional translations, a steward, which is why we have Stewardship Sunday. A steward is crooked. And then he behaves in an even more crooked way to get himself out of trouble. And what's even stranger is that the man he defrauds commends him for it. The subtle distinction we need to keep in mind here is that it's not Jesus that commends his behavior, it's the man's boss who was ripped off who commends his behavior. But the story is still difficult. It forces us to think, which is maybe what Jesus wanted. Much of the Gospel of Luke, if you read Luke, has to do with the subject of money and the danger of either being seduced by material things or, more likely, living with chronic anxiety and fear of not having enough. This particular story, then, is just one part of the overall message. A rich man had a steward who discovered that he was squandering his money. In today's terms, he'd be running up the expense account, staying at fancy hotels, eating lobster every night, and maybe siphoning some money off into his own private accounts. This was not a good employee. And when the boss found out, he told him he was fired. But unlike today, where, the security guards would come and he would be escorted off the premises before he could do any further harm, this guy was told, "Get the accounts in order before you leave." Big mistake. So what did he do? He was in a panic. He was too old to dig ditches, too proud to beg, and he clearly hadn't saved a penny. So the best he could come up with was to try to curry favor with his master's debtors. If he helped them enough, one of them might even give him a job. When the first debtor came before him, he asked how much was owed. The man said 900 gallons of oil. The manager instructed him to take his bill and change it to 450. That's a 50% discount. Pretty good. The next man owed 1,000 bushels of wheat. He told him to make it 800. We can tie ourselves in knots trying to figure out why one guy got a bigger discount than the other, but probably it had more to do with what could fly under the radar without being picked up as suspects somewhere along the line. Everyone in this deal looks bad. The steward and the tradesman. We wouldn't want to do business with any of these people. The crooked steward's master did not remain ignorant of his schemes. He was found out. But in a bizarre twist of fate, the master actually admired the man's audacious and bizarre act of self-interest. It was blatant. The steward was not a good man. He was corrupt, but he was shrewd. And the master, a shrewd man himself, recognized as much and admired at least that quality. And it is here that Jesus makes a statement that we have to stop and carefully ponder. Jesus said, "For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings." Let me read that again. "For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings." The only way we can possibly connect gaining friends with being welcomed into eternal dwellings is to use our money to expand the kingdom of God. That's the only thing that makes sense. The corruption of the steward is not really relevant. Jesus used that to really get our attention. The part of what the steward did that we should emulate is that he used his money in a single-minded fashion to build a network of friends. In other words, we should use our money to help people and to reach them with the good news of God's forgiveness and grace. The steward was highly skilled at looking out for himself. We should be equally skilled at looking out for others. Jesus then shifted gears and he became very blunt and straightforward, saying, "Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with little will be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy handling worldly wealth, who's going to trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who's going to give you your own property? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." The way we handle money is a test for how we will handle greater responsibility. It is a training ground. And we all know the principle of giving someone a little responsibility and seeing how they handle it before we give them greater responsibility. I know that when I want to see how someone is going to handle potentially a leadership position, I ask them to do small things first. But if that person is the kind that says, "Oh yeah, I'll do it," and then repeatedly fails to carry through, I stop asking. Because I know that if they can't be trusted with a small thing, I can't possibly give them the larger thing. And that's what God does with us, with all of the material things we are given in life. If a person is faithful in small things, a person will be faithful with more. Money and material goods are neither good nor bad. They just are. There's no moral worth attached to a vehicle or a house or an item of clothing. It just exists. The problem is with us. With our greed, but more often with our fear. Jesus said no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. But we are very attached to our money. And it's not because we are greedy or evil. It's because we are fearful that we won't have enough. No one wants to be homeless. No one wants to live in a home that is falling down around them and they don't have the funds to repair the roof or get the new furnace or do what has to be done. No one wants to face the landlord and be told, you're out. No one wants bills that they cannot afford to pay. And few people enjoy budgeting on a razor-thin edge. When my children were young and we lived in Scotland, I budgeted on a shoestring. Granted, it was the 1980s, but in Scotland, it felt like being in the 1940s. When I was a student, you know how we refrigerated things? You open the window and put it on the windowsill. You know, go get the milk, open the window and get the milk. That's refrigeration. There were people that still had outdoor bathrooms, outhouses. Not many, but they were there. We lived on a very minimum salary. The only thing I bought my children were shoes, because you had to buy shoes that actually fit them, underwear, hard to get secondhand, and school uniforms. Everything else came from my parents or charity bags. And I never shopped for myself. All my clothing came out of a great big bag that somebody handed in. Oh, that sweater looks nice, I'll try that one. The thought of going to the store and actually shopping has been radical for me. I still don't do it very much, I feel too guilty. Food. The food budget was always a challenge. We could not afford fresh vegetables and fruit. Just couldn't afford it. But in Scotland, at least in the 80s, the grocery store always had a section of the bruised and damaged stuff. And you could buy that at a fraction of the price. So I always did. That's where I shopped. When I came home one summer and went grocery shopping with a friend and asked where the bruisey fruit was, she dragged me out of the store. She was mortified with embarrassment. How could you do that? I'm like, I wasn't embarrassed. It was sensible. It's perfectly good stuff, I said. Why waste it? You just cut off the damaged parts. The kids don't know. Chop it up. It's fine. As far as I was concerned, I was just being a good steward with limited resources. And you can ask Vicki even today, that toothpaste does not get thrown out until it is begging for every last bit of it. She hands the almost squeezed out tube to me and says, okay, I give up, you use that one. I'll get another month out of it before she would throw it away. I had to bite my tongue this summer when my daughter-in-law proceeded to throw out strawberries and potatoes and things that I would have definitely gotten more use out of. I just took a deep breath and went, let it go, let it go. I would have used those things. You do not waste. Now, by middle-class American standards, and it's a good thing my parents aren't here because they'd be horrified hearing this, by middle-class American standards, I was poor. But by the standards of the parish that my ex-husband and I served, I was rich. Because I lived in a nice house. And I could feed my kids. And I did have clothes to wear. We served one of the poorest parishes in Scotland with 60% unemployment. It's all relative. And we always had enough. We paid our tithe to the church. Out of that meager income, we paid our 10%, and we always had enough. I remember people coming, knocking on the door and handing me food. When 5 minutes earlier I had been going, okay, God, what's for dinner? We always had enough. God provided. And since that time, whenever I've had a financial crisis, I have learned not to panic. I just turn to God and say, okay, how are you going to do it this time? And God does one of two things. Either shows me how I actually have the money if I do things differently and make a few rearrangements, or just flat out directly provides through others. When my daughter became addicted to opiates and I had to get her into rehab, I had a 50% scholarship from the Caring Foundation and had to come up with $13,000. Do you know people just gave me money? It just poured in. Members of this congregation who aren't even here anymore. One couple gave me a $5,000 interest-free loan, which I paid off over 3 years. Other people, some who are still sitting here, just gave me, here's $1,000, here's $500. My daughter has been clean and sober for 10 years. They saved her life. My gratitude knows no bounds. God's economy is a beautiful thing. God is faithful. I have learned not to fear. I have learned that God wants us to invest in things that last, that are eternal. There are no trailers on a hearse. God promises us that when we put our priorities in order, in the right way, when we make that commitment, God will provide for us. Some people tithe, they give 10% of their net income. Others give a higher or a lower percentage. But I do recommend making it a consistent percentage, because if it's not part of the family budget, otherwise what we human beings do is we push it off into the optional category. And y'all know what happens in the optional category, right? Optional goes right out the window. If God gets what's left over, there is nothing left over. So God says, trust me. Give to me first. I will take care of you. And I can give you 100% absolute confirmation of the fact that when you trust God in this way, God will provide. God doesn't answer our every whim like some kind of a divine genie, but God always meets our needs. And sometimes